I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, global gathering. President Joe Biden arrives in Japan for the G7 summit. Abortion in America. Reaction after the Food and Drug Administration issues a ruling on an abortion pill. First of its kind. Why the governor of Montana signed a measure banning a popular social media app. And adoring fans. A closer look at an initiative in Poland dedicated to the Eucharist. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the feast of Pope St. John Paul I. Our top story tonight, President Joe Biden faces a debt ceiling debate at home and tricky issues overseas. He traveled to Japan to meet with other world leaders while his advisors back here in the U.S. seek to reach a debt deal with Republicans in Congress. President Joe Biden arrives in Japan to prepare for the G7 summit. Topics are expected to include everything from China to Ukraine. President Biden greeted U.S. troops overseas before meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida.
When our countries stand together, we stand stronger. And I believe the whole world is safer when we do.
The Prime Minister calls the Japan-U.S. alliance the cornerstone of peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region.
As you said back in January when you were at the White House, I think the quote is, we face one of the most complex environments in recent history, security environments. And I couldn't agree with you more. But I'm proud that the United States and Japan are facing it together.
President Biden earlier announced that he would shorten his international trip so he can return to D.C. for debt ceiling talks.
The president felt like, given the looming deadline and given where the teams were in the last couple of days, that the best use of his time was to be back in Washington to make sure that Congress does its duty.
Vice President Kamala Harris is also tracking the debate over the debt. She participated in the last Oval Office meeting with congressional leaders and held a virtual press briefing today. Vice President Harris says a default would not be acceptable under any circumstances. She says America must pay its bills. One 8-year-old girl has died while in U.S. Border Patrol custody. This as facilities struggle with overcrowding. The girl and her family were being held in the Rio Grande Valley, one of the busiest border crossing areas. She experienced a medical emergency and died after being taken to a local hospital. The girl was from Panama and reportedly suffered from heart issues her entire life. While high-stakes battle is taking place in a federal appeals court, the issue is whether the widely used abortion pill mifepristone should remain on the market after challenges to its FDA approval dating back more than 20 years. The case will likely head to the U.S. Supreme Court. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales reports. Eric?
Well, good evening, Tracy. As the appeals process continues, Democrats on Capitol Hill, well, they're doubling down on abortion on demand. They've introduced the Affordability is Access Act. It would ensure that once the FDA determines that an over-the-counter abortion pill option is safe, then women across the country could use it without any delay.
We have to fight for our vision of the future, a future where getting the birth control that you need is as simple and easy as picking up Advil or Tylenol at the pharmacy. No hoops to jump, no questions you have to answer, and no extra cost.
The Affordability is Access Act would also require that insurers fully cover over-the-counter birth control.
How important it is that this particular over-the-counter contraception is not only available, but is affordable through insurance coverage, and that is what our bill will do.
If passed, any FDA-approved abortion pill must be available without a doctor's prescription in the United States. Republicans say Democrats, including President Joe Biden, want abortion on demand.
The Biden administration seems to be on a march to try to expand abortion in the country and to violate a long-standing rule, the Hyde rule.
The Hyde Amendment dates back to the 1970s that no taxpayer funds can be used for abortions. Congressman Chris Smith, co-chair of the Congressional Pro-Life Caucus, tells me if this new measure is passed, mothers and babies will lose in the end.
In a country where the death toll from abortion is well in excess of 63 million dead baby since 1973. How dare Joe Biden try to promote that tragedy to the rest of the world? And that's exactly what he does every day.
Senator Graham tells me Democrats also want to throw out the Helms Amendment, a federal law that prohibits abortion pills from being mailed.
It's a pretty radical thing they're doing. They're basically cutting out doctor consultations and let it go through the mail.
Congressman Chris Smith tells me that he and other members of the pro-life caucus plan to fight this bill in the U.S. House if it does make it to the U.S. House. He says that he's going to make sure that it never gets to the floor. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
As we reported earlier this week, lawmakers on Capitol Hill recently held a hearing to revisit the implications of the FACE Act. One attorney who gave testimony pointed to more than the 100 recent attacks against pro-life pregnancy centers.
Yet despite these numerous attacks to life-affirming reproductive health facilities, the Department of Justice has indicted just 4 individuals under the FACE Act in the past year. More concerning is the response of
Jeremy Dice also said that many state attorneys general and even the FBI have been targeting pro-lifers for violations of the FACE Act while ignoring similar actions from pro-abortion groups. In response, Senator Jim Jordan threatened to withhold funding from the FBI. And we go now to Jeremy Dice, Senior Counsel for First Liberty Institute. Jeremy, great to have you back on. So tell us why you felt so compelled to give testimony on this.
Well, because the FACE Act is blind to ideology, and yet after a year of witnessing just horrific crimes against these life-affirming reproductive health facilities, pregnancy care centers, as we often know about them, the FBI has done very little to turn back even one individual. We've only seen 4 people indicted under a single indictment in the past year. So justice delayed has been justice denied for our friends in the pro-life community. But the FACE Act provides very real protections, and it is incumbent upon the Attorney General of the United States to direct his department to not only investigate these crimes, but then to return indictment after indictment to send a very clear message that if you're going to pick up a brick or a crowbar to express your political disagreement, you're going to be held accountable under the rule of law. And if we don't do that, then the rule of law itself is going to suffer drastically.
Jeremy, what were some of the things that you touched on or highlighted in your remarks?
Yeah, well, I reminded the Congress there that, we've had 2 very different experiences. Not only does the FACE Act require the Attorney General to do something about this, but it authorizes state attorneys general. And there's been a really big difference between the applications of that. In the state of Massachusetts, for instance, where multiple centers were vandalized with threats of Jane's revenge, and if abortion is not safe, neither are you, paint bombs and broken windows and all the like trying to intimidate these life-affirming reproductive health facilities. The Attorney General there not only did not use the FACE Act to prosecute these individuals, she actually set out to put out sanctions on these institutions that had been already vandalized. She didn't even so much as put out a tip line to seek information about the vandals that attacked these facilities. But the contrast is there in the state of Florida, where in Ashley Moody's office, the Attorney General for the state of Florida, once she knew the names of the individuals who had targeted these pro-life centers, she filed a lawsuit on behalf of the FACE Act seeking the maximum civil penalties available to her office under the FACE Act. That's how you hold people accountable to the rule of law.
As far as this congressional hearing itself, what stood out the most to you about it?
Well, I thought it was remarkable how some of the congressmen there were unaware that the pregnancy care centers, these life-affirming reproductive health centers, they actually do qualify for protection under the FACE Act. And some of them were rather upset that they would dare utilize the law that was, in their mind, meant to protect only abortion centers instead of these life-affirming reproductive health facilities. I was also surprised by one of my co-witnesses on the panel that was arrested at the point of several guns by the FBI in his own house for having defended his own son as they were peacefully protesting outside of an abortion center in Pennsylvania. And I think that shocking testimony ought to wake up the entire country to remind ourselves that when the FACE Act is there to be holding people accountable for their acts of intimidation and injury and interference with access to a reproductive health facility, that means everybody that engages in reproductive health, including life-affirming centers like these pregnancy care centers, they also deserve the protection of the law. when we try to move this in an inequitable direction, that's when the rule of law suffers and people are going to continue to be hurt. If the Attorney General Garland does not soon begin returning more and more indictments, what will happen is that more violence will spread, greater threats will be issued, and I fear what that would mean for these volunteers and staff of these centers who have already been harassed for the past year for doing nothing more than caring for women in their unplanned pregnancies. That should never be the case.
Jeremy, we have maybe 30 seconds left or so, but any final thoughts before I let you go?
Yeah, I'd encourage folks to go to firstliberty.org where they can read our lawsuit. After Attorney General Moody filed her lawsuit, that allowed us then to seek civil penalties on behalf of Heartbeat of Miami, where we sued Jane's Revenge for their intimidating efforts to shut that facility down. But all that starts with the Attorney General of the United States. It's incumbent upon him to direct the Department of Justice to use all of the resources to protect every American, not just those whom he agrees with politically.
We're going to leave it right there. Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on. I always appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed a series of bills to protect children. They include banning children from transgender surgery, going to so-called drag shows, and how schools use pronouns and bathrooms.
I mean, they're trying to do sex change operations on minors, giving them things like puberty blockers and doing things that are irreversible to them. And that is not based on science. That is not based on evidence.
The measures restrict discussion of personal pronouns in schools and requires people to use bathrooms associated with their biological sex. Meanwhile, Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to launch his presidential bid next week. The governor of Montana has signed a measure to ban the popular social media app TikTok in his state. Republican Greg Gianforte signed the measure. There are about 200,000 TikTok users in Montana. A further 6,000 businesses also use the platform. Supporters of the bill say that the Chinese government could harvest data from the app to push misinformation. The ban will not take effect until January 2024. We have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including problems in Portugal. The country's president runs out of options to fight an assisted suicide bill. And adoring the Eucharist. A closer look at a special gathering for the faithful in Poland. Portugal's president recently signed a measure to decriminalize assisted suicide. President Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa signed the measure after lawmakers overrode all 4 of his attempts to veto it. According to law, after the 4th attempt, the bill must be put into action. Portugal is the 6th European Union country to allow assisted suicide. Pope Francis recently spoke out against the measure in the majority Catholic country. And we go now to Alex Schadenberg, Executive Director of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. Alex, always good to be with you. A lot to talk about today, but first, I want to focus on Portugal. As mentioned, it is a majority Catholic country, about 80% of the population there. Yet we see euthanasia is now legal after the parliament there overturned the president's last veto. What do you think is happening here, and why this huge push for assisted suicide?
Well, Portugal is a country that has really changed in the last few years because it, in the last 2 elections, has elected quite, how would you say, left-wing governments. And so they have been pushing for several things, including assisted suicide. The earlier bills that they had passed that had been vetoed, they were all a little bit more, how would you say, wide open, and they tried to tighten the language a bit. But the problem, of course, comes to the very concept of legalizing euthanasia and assisted suicide itself, because it says in law that it's okay for doctors to be able to kill a patient or be involved with killing a patient. And of course, that is something that really changes everything in medical ethics.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, euthanasia is now legal in 6 European countries, and that includes the Netherlands, where last month lawmakers considered a measure to allow assisted suicide for children between the ages of 1 to 12. Alex, what's the latest on that? Do you know, and where does this end?
Okay, so the situation in the Netherlands is a little different because they actually have sort of promulgated it through the government. So what they've said is that the law in the Netherlands allowed euthanasia from the ages of 12 and up with parental consent, and after 16, someone could decide for themselves. But they also had this other sort of rule that they had agreed to, which was called the Groningen Protocol, which allowed for the euthanasia of newborns. So what the government in fact did is they said we're extending that Groningen Protocol to age 12, which means that there would have to be an agreement between a doctor and parents that they would actually then do a euthanasia of someone under the age of 12, someone considered a child per se. But this is also being debated in Canada too. As you might know, we've had this discussion that they're talking about child euthanasia in Canada, and this is the next thing. We had a recent government committee also talking about these same things. Where the whole thing is becoming underpinned is this whole concept of killing has just been lost. And so we're saying, oh, well, we're trying to end suffering, but actually what they're really doing is killing people. They're ending the life of the person rather than ending the suffering. So as you know, we're all for providing good care for someone, good pain and symptom management. We're completely opposed to killing people.
Yeah, and speaking of your country, a new poll came out there and said more than a quarter of the population believes assisted suicide should be legal for both homelessness and poverty. I mean, this is just mind-blowing, Alex.
Well, it is actually pretty crazy, in fact, because we've had several cases of these situations where somebody has asked for euthanasia based on poverty. They were approved based on having a disability, but they were actually asking for it based on the fact that they're living in poverty. And the concept of this is really sort of like, you have to understand, when we legalize euthanasia, everything turns upside down. And, we could have a whole show on this very concept, what happens in this whole mindset that now it's okay for doctors, or in Canada, nurses also can kill people, because then the question becomes, well, under what circumstances? But in Canada, we really don't have any circumstances left. It says you have to have unremittent suffering and you have to have an irremediable medical condition. Well, what does it mean to have an irremediable medical condition? It means having a disability or having some chronic condition, etc. And we're seeing massive numbers of deaths, huge increases in the number of deaths, and huge reasons for increases for these deaths. So this is very concerning. Now, going back to that beginning about Portugal, I think it's important to note again, and you said in your headline that it was vetoed, it was stopped 4 times. So how it actually worked is the first law had passed and it was sent to the Constitutional Court in Portugal, and they rejected it. The second law passed and the president vetoed it, but he knew the election was coming, so he knew they didn't have time to overturn his veto. The third time he sent it to the Constitutional Court and they rejected it again, and now the fourth time he's vetoed it, but the parliament overturned his veto. So, I have to give him credit for fighting this so long and trying to stop it, because the fact of it is very few people have done what he's done in order to prevent the killing of people, because he's gone back. And now, of course, at this point, he has no choice, because the parliament overrode his veto. He was forced to sign the bill.
I know. Well, Alex, so much more we can talk about, and thank you so much for coming on. We'll have to have you back on. It's a shame all this is happening, but we're so glad that you're, advocating for life. So thank you so much, Alex, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, the United Nations is seeking around $3 billion for urgent humanitarian aid to war-torn Sudan. Thousands have left the North African country since violence began a month ago. Those who remain are without electricity, water, and food. Volunteer groups are providing hot meals and assistance to 1/3 of the country. Around 800 civilians have died in the clashes. Well, the Pakistani Prime Minister and President of Iran have opened the first of 6 border markets since relations between the eastern countries have improved. In a televised meeting, the 2 leaders agreed to enhance trade and economic ties. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, deadly flooding, an update on a natural disaster in Italy, plus strengthening the faith. EWTN Poland holds a Eucharistic-themed Congress. Welcome back. Pope Francis is offering prayers for the lives lost after the recent flooding in northern Italy. The Holy Father sent a telegram to Cardinal Matteo Maria Zuppi, Archbishop of Bologna, with his condolences after the intense rainfall caused severe flooding and landslides. Thousands have been evacuated from the worst hit areas. Local officials say some areas received 20 inches of rain in 36 hours. The Vatican withdraws a Youth Day stamp after receiving criticism for its resemblance to a nationalistic propaganda. The stamp has an image of Pope Francis leading young people. Just last week, the Vatican said the image was designed to show Pope Francis guiding the youth and the church. The Vatican has not released any further information. The faithful in Poland recently gathered to commemorate Adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. The first Congress of Perpetual Adoration brought together faith leaders and experts on Eucharistic miracles. They gathered late last week in an effort to strengthen the faith of Catholics in Poland. The initiative was organized by our partners at EWTN Poland. Joining us now from Poland is Ivo Bender, Regional Manager of EWTN in Central and Eastern Europe. Ivo, great to see you again. First off, tell us a little bit more about this event, why you put it together, and what was the reaction?
Well, thank you for having me. It's always good to be with you. And, the event really was marking the 5th anniversary of EWTN in Poland. I must say that the guys from EWTN Poland were very nervous, very worried, but it turns out that it was a great success. There was probably about 2,000 people in attendance. Also, it's the most important thing is that it was connected with the first Adoration Congress. Maybe it was the first step into an annual event, hopefully. We had very positive reactions. We had great speakers. We had lots of people, but the most important thing, of course, was that in the center of this all was the Eucharist.
Absolutely. I know you chose to name the event after a quote from Pope Pius IX on the importance of the Eucharist. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think we don't remember this Pope, whose pontificate was, in terms of length, second only to St. Peter's. He was an absolutely colossal figure of the 19th century. It was very difficult for the Poles because there was no Poland in the 19th century. Poland was carved up by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century. And Pius IX was probably the greatest advocate of the Polish cause during the 19th century.
Eva, we are just about out of time, but quickly I want to ask you about this. I know there were several initiatives, including the blessing of motorcyclists. What more can you tell us about that?
Very briefly, it is the official beginning of the motorcycle season in Poland. So about 600 to 700 motorcyclists, especially from the Lower Silesia, the western part of Poland, came to this beautiful monastery of Krzeszów, an old Cistercian monastery, and they just want to show their faith and begin their season in a holy way, and also pray for those who lost their lives. Because let's face it, it is not a pastime for the people who are not shall we say, they're not risk averse. So I think that increases their zeal for the Catholic faith. Beautiful moment. However, when they started their engines all at the same time in the churchyard, it was quite an event, and I must say I had to sort of find a more secure and quieter location.
Well, Ivo, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. We always appreciate it. Ivo Bender, Regional Manager of EWTN in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night, and God bless.